Today's date is 4 June 2022. My name is Dennis Gill. I am in Reading, Pennsylvania at the World War II weekend, having the pleasure of sitting down with Stephen Bosan. Thank you, sir, for sitting down and talking to us. If you could just give us a little background on yourself. Where were you born? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, I was born in Newark, New Jersey.
Okay.
I have an older brother, and in 1926, my older brother started school. He wasn't in there a little while before he came down with scarlet fever. So the doctor recommended to my mother and father that we move out in the country. My grandfather lived out in Fairfield, New Jersey, so we moved out across the road from him.
Okay.
That was 1927. I remember vividly because that's the year Lindbergh flew across the ocean.
Right.
And we listened to it on the radio.
Gotcha.
I started school in 1928 for 8 years.
Okay.
Finished in 1936. We moved back to Newark because my father worked for Bell Telephone Company and they moved his place of business. My brother finished high school in February of 39, and that was the height of the Depression. So he couldn't get a job, so he joined the Navy. He was assigned to a destroyer and he stayed on that the whole war.
Okay.
I started high school in 1940. I'm sorry, I graduated in 1940. And I wanted to go to get a job. My mother wouldn't let me. She said, "You're going to go to college."
Right.
My mother and father both were immigrants, come from Europe. So I wanted to work outside, so the school counselor said, "What about being a park ranger at Yellowstone or Grand Canyon?" I said, "That sounds wonderful." So I went to college at Utah State University.
Okay.
They have ROTC there, mandatory for the male students to have 2 years of ROTC. I had that 1940 or 41 and got back in December of 42, and the people at the ROTC said, "The Army's not going to let you stay for 4 years. So you're going to have to make a choice. Either you come in the Army, join the Army, or go through basic training, OCS, and go up from there, or you go back to the draft board." Not much of a choice.
Right.
So I joined the Army in December 1942. And they called us to active duty January. And I went to Camp Callan, California, which is now Torrey Pines, the golf club. Went through basic training, then went through OCS at Camp Davis, North Carolina, which was the anti-aircraft OCS. My first assignment as a second lieutenant was Camp Stewart, Georgia. It was an all-black battalion, white officers.
Okay.
I was there about a month. They broke the battalion up. And because I had 2 years of college, they sent me to Fort Belvoir to become an engineer officer. I became an engineer, went to Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, and got there just in time. The battalion was alerted to go overseas. So we got on a troop train. We went all the way through Chicago and Cleveland, Harrisburg, to Camp Kilmer, New Jersey. We loaded aboard a transport at Brooklyn Army Terminal and went to England. About 4 days out from New York, everybody started yelling and we're running up on deck, and there was the Queen Mary.
Yeah.
Going right through the convoy.
Wow.
So we went to England and we stayed in Weston-super-Mare. About 2 months of training. We received our equipment. We went to Weymouth, England, got aboard an LST. Sailed across an LST to the channel to Utah Beach, offloaded there. This, of course, was after D-Day.
Right.
And we convoyed across France to Verdun, France, where we joined the Third Army. And we went with them all the rest of the way. We built bridges. We weren't not in direct combat, but we built bridges.
Okay.
Supported the division engineers and cleared minefields and so on. One day I got the job of clearing a minefield in an old apple orchard in just outside of trying to think of the town. Anyway, and we were going out there. We stopped for a break on the road, and I heard this Jeep coming up from behind us. And he pulled right up in front of me, and it was General Patton.
Wow.
So,
did you meet him?
Yeah, I saluted and I reported to him what I was doing. And this was Luxembourg. That's where we were. So we went from there to across Germany. We built bridges, and we got to the Rhine River at Boppard, Germany, Boppard. And my platoon was sent to help a bridge company put a floating bridge across the Rhine.
Okay.
The Rhine River was 1,200 feet wide at that point. We had just occupied the east bank, and that was one of the few times I was in combat because we were fired upon by the Germans constantly. We built the bridge, we crossed the Rhine and worked our way all the way through almost to Nuremberg when I got a job to check a bridge site out. So I went with my Jeep and my driver and my supply sergeant. We went around a bend in the woods there, and there was a German armored car sitting on the road. So my Jeep driver said, "Jesus Christ, Lieutenant." I said, "Step on the gas." So we went out of there. We went around another bend, and we got hit by one of our trucks.
Right.
Broke both my legs down
Wow.
here. So I was put in the hospital, the VAC hospital, just like you see on MASH.
Right.
Spent about 3 days there, and they operated on me May 6th, I think it was. Anyway, it was VE Day. And when I was coming out of the ether, the nurse said, "Listen, Lieutenant, you've got to listen to this." And over the loudspeaker, there was Winston Churchill giving the VE Day speech. So I was put on a hospital ship at Bristol, England. We sailed back to Charleston, South Carolina. A hospital train to Pittsburgh, and then from Pittsburgh to Butler, Pennsylvania by ambulance. I stayed in the hospital until December of 45.
Okay.
Got discharged, put back on duty. I went to Camp Campbell, Kentucky, and was assigned to a maintenance company there. In July of 45, we traveled to Chicago to participate in the parade, and Harry Truman was the reviewing officer. I got out of the Army, went to reserve in December of 46. January 47, I went to Florida, where I was offered a job as a fire protection engineer in Jacksonville. I worked the northern half of Florida, Tampa, Florida, and then Miami, Florida. I joined a reserve outfit while I was down there to make some more money. And they got called to active duty in the Korean War. So I had no choice but to go. This was an aviation engineer battalion. We went to Fort Huachuca for training. While I was there, they said, "You're going to stay here while we go to Korea."
Okay.
And so I said, "How can I get out of this?" And there was a friend of mine said, "Why don't you apply for Army Aviation?" So I said, "Sure." So I did. Became an aviator at Fort or Camp San Marcos Air Force Base, and then Fort Sill, Oklahoma.
Okay.
When I graduated, they sent me to San Francisco, where I joined a topographic outfit. I ferried an airplane from San Francisco to Anchorage, Alaska, and then I was stationed in Alaska for the summer of 1953. Came back to San Francisco in 53, 54, and got orders to go to Korea, but had to go to helicopter school first. So I went back to San Marcos Air Force Base and Fort Sill, and then I went by troop ship to Korea. I was the commander of a flight detachment for KMAG, Korean Military Advisory Group. And I flew the Korean generals and the American generals all around there.
You
Came
flew
back-
helicopters?
Helicopters, yeah. Came back to the States in 55 and went to North Dakota as the Army Aviation Advisor to the National Guard.
Okay.
And ended up flying fixed wing in helicopters. I got assigned the job of flying the governor of North Dakota, John Davis, all over.
Okay.
So, anyway, got orders to go to Panama to another topo outfit. In the meantime, the Army said, if you can go to college for 6 months and get a degree, we'll send you there. I said, sure. So I went to college, got my 6 months and got my degree. Meanwhile, they changed my orders from Panama to Fort Eustis, Virginia. I got transferred to the Transportation Corps.
Wow.
So I went to Fort Eustis, went through the advanced course, officer's advanced course and maintenance course. And then they sent me to France to be a company commander of a large helicopter company, which was fine because we kept helicopters in Paris, so I got to visit a lot in Paris.
Right.
I got to fly the U.S. Ambassador General Jim, what was his name? Gavin, 82nd Airborne Commander in D-Day. I flew him quite a bit. Goodwill tour of France, down to the Riviera, all around. Came back to the States and went to Command General Staff College. Finished that, went back to Washington. Got assigned to the Army staff as an assignment officer for 3 years. When I finished that 3 years, they sent me back to school again to Armed Forces Staff College at Norfolk Navy Base.
Okay.
Went to Vietnam and became a battalion commander of an aircraft maintenance battalion. Had 10 companies, 2,000 men. And I had that for a year. I was there during the Tet Offensive. And very fortunately, we didn't lose any men. Came back to the States, was assigned to the Pentagon again. This was time on the Army General Staff. As the handle all quotas for flight school, Army flight school. About that time, I came up on the list for colonel. So they said, well, we got no place for you here as a colonel on flight status. So I went looking for another job, but I didn't want to leave Washington because I'd been flying all over the damn country.
Right.
So they assigned me to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on a study group. I worked on that for a year. And then when that disbanded, I stayed in J4, which is the logistics side, and handled war plans. The Army or the government has war plans for everything you can think of. And my job was to maintain the transportation annex to the war plans, keep them up to date. Then I got transferred within JCS to the Secretary of the Joint Transportation Board,
Right.
which sets the priorities for all the services in the event of a war. And I worked that for about a year. Then they said, well, you've been in Washington too long. It's time you get out in the field. So I said, well, where can I go? And they said, well, we're going to send you to Fort Eustis, Virginia. You're going to be the Assistant Commandant for Combat Developments and Transportation Corps, which I did.
Okay.
That time, I was up to almost 30 years of active commissioned service, and that's the end. You have, or 55 years of age, you have to retire.
Right.
So I said, okay, where can I go? And they said, well, we'll send you to New Cumberland Army Depot in Pennsylvania, and you can be the director of maintenance, the rebuild of all the Chinook helicopters for the Army, which is a big job. So I had about a 1,500 civilian workforce there, and I worked there 3 years, from 73 to 76.
Okay.
Then I retired in November of 76 with 30 years of active service and 4 years of reserve, 34 years. And I didn't do anything for 2 years. My wife got tired of me being around. She said, why don't you get out and get a job? She said, you're young yet. I said, well, all right. So I went out looking, but nobody wanted to hire me because they said you're really overqualified. I said, well, they said, you really wouldn't like that job. I said, yeah, I would enjoy it. They said, no. Well, about that time, I got a call from a man who lived across the street from where we did. We lived in Camp Hill.
Okay.
And he said, well, I understand you're looking for a job. I said, yeah. He said, well, I'm the president of the Hospital Association of Pennsylvania. We're looking for someone to be able to handle personnel and all the things that go with it.
Right.
So I said, okay. So I went in for an interview and they hired me. So I worked for 17 more years. And I retired again in 1996. My wife came down with cancer, and I felt I shouldn't leave her alone anymore. So I retired in November of 96. And I didn't do anything for a couple of years except travel. I ran into my former secretary. My wife died in November of 2000. In 2003, I ran into my former secretary, who was retiring from the Army, from the Department of Defense. And we got together, and I decided I'd ask her to travel if she wanted to travel with me. So we went to Alaska, Australia, New Zealand, France. We sailed on the Mediterranean for a month, spent a month in Hawaii, took a lot of train trips, and we visited almost every national park in America. And that's where I am now.
Wow.
I don't travel anymore. As I said, I turned 100 last month.
Right.
And I can't walk the way I used to, and I can't get around as much.
Right.
So my son bought a house next to his in Mechanicsburg, and he takes care of me, and I'm just sitting pretty. And that's my story.
Wow. Are there any stories that stand out about your time in combat? Anything particular?
Just the Tet Offensive.
Yeah.
That one, yeah, I got caught in that one. We were shipping an outfit out to Da Nang, and I was in Quy Nhon at the time. That's when we were loading at the border in LST.
Okay.
And I had to fight my way back to the airfield. Maybe another interesting experience in the Pentagon. I was assigned to a roster, a duty roster. I think you've seen many times where people, presidents and heads of state, come visit the states, and they at the White House they have a real formal ceremony for them.
Right.
You always see a big audience in the back. I was part of that
You're one of
audience.
the audience. Yeah.
I was on that roster. So if they had somebody would coming in, they would call me on the phone and say, "Go down to the bus station. You're going to be down in the east lawn of the White House."
Right.
Well, when President Kennedy was assassinated, I got a call to go to Fort McNair, and they assigned me as an escort officer for Adlai Stevenson, who was U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
Right.
So for the 4 days of the funeral, I was right in the front constantly. And when I was in the cathedral for the religious ceremony, I was there with the Secret Service and the White House staff and Department of Defense staff, and checking the invitations as they came in. And I heard this voice, "Just a minute," and I turned in there with Jacqueline Kennedy, that far away from me with her 2 children. And she said, where are we supposed to go?" And I said, "Just a minute." And they came up and took care of her, seated her.
Right.
And the other thing was at the rotunda when they had him lying in state, I was there with Stevenson and members of the House of Representatives. And what's his name? Anyway, one of the officials came up and said, "Do you have the information about this, the timing and all that?" I said, "Yeah." As we were talking, a reporter ran up and he said, "They just shot, the assassin,
Right.
Oscar, what was his name?
Lee Harvey Oswald?
Oswald.
Yeah.
They come on over here to the camera, you can see it live." So we walked over and saw that. But I was there right to the very end when they buried him in plate taps. So after that, that particular happened, of course, in '63. But I retired, as I said before, in 96 rather. So that's it.
Yeah. You said, I'm going to go back real quick. You said that you were during the Tet Offensive, you had to fight your way back. So tell us about that.
Oh, well, we were shipping our company up north to Da Nang with the 1st Cav Division.
Okay.
I had a company of heavy maintenance that supported them. And we had a lot of trucks. And the highway was not open to driving. Highway 1, which runs along the coast of Vietnam from Saigon all the way up to the capital. So we had arranged for an LST to carry the trucks up there.
Right.
And the LST was crewed by a Korean crew. They had a Korean lieutenant. And when I went down there about 9 o'clock at night, we had 4 trucks that hadn't gotten on the LST yet. And when you load an LST, you back everything into it so you can drive out forward.
Okay.
And the 4 trucks hadn't gotten in there yet. So the Korean lieutenant was yelling at the crew to pull up the ramp and close the bow doors. He was going to retract off the beach right there. And I said, "No, you can't do that. Got 4 trucks yet." He said, "No, I don't care, I said, well, I was willing to pull my rifle on him if I had to. So they waited long enough for that. But then tracers were coming all through Quy Nhon.
Okay.
And I was in a Jeep with the company commander. We were trying to work our way back to the airfield. And we were being fired upon. We came up on a Jeep, was sitting on the road with 2 people in it. They were laying over on the steering wheel and on the side of the truck. So I told the company commander, "Do you know who that is?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "That's contract people from the States." So I said, well, they look dead to me. He said, yeah, they are. So I said, well, you stay here. I got out of the Jeep and I crawled on my face up to the Jeep. And I got their wallets and their cards, their ID cards, just so that they would be known. I didn't know what happened to them. But we worked our way back to the airfield and we got fired on by our own people. But we finally got back to the airfield. In Vietnam, whenever you leave the city limits, you're in enemy territory. And if you're flying a helicopter, the first thing you do is go up about 2,000 feet, and then you leave the city limits.
Right.
And you never fly at night unless you absolutely have to, because if you make a forced landing, you're stuck,
Yeah.
So I know one night we were coming back, and I couldn't avoid going flying at night. Guy behind me, I was pilot, and the guy behind me in the seat, he poked me on the shoulder. He says, "Hey, Steve," he said, "look at that, fireworks." And I looked over the side, and there was these green tracers coming up at us. The Vietnamese were using Soviet ammunition, and they have green tracers instead of red.
Okay.
So I applied more power, climbed higher. I said, "Sheriff, they're not fireworks. That's somebody shooting at us." He said, "Well, for Christ's sake, hurry up." I said, "Okay." The other time I was in combat was when we were crossing the Rhine River. In order to put a bridge out, you have to occupy the forwards, the back, the forward back. Then they put a big cable across the river, and as you bring your bridge sections out on floats, you tie them to this cable.
Okay.
And the Germans occupied the east bank, we occupied the west bank. Or was it the other way around? Yeah, east bank. Anyway, they were firing on us, and we got some anti-aircraft units come in to help us because they were flying down trying to bomb the bridge. And they had some up right out here with quad 50s on them, on half tracks. So we got some of them down on the riverbank, and they fired across the riverbank and stopped the Germans from firing on us. Then we had an infantry company come in and set up mortars and artillery, and they were firing them. The floating bridge has rubber pontons, and there are 12 sections in the ponton. You're blowing up with air. They leak air, and of course, if they get hit with bullets, they leak a lot more.
Yeah.
So you have to run an air compressor out on the bridge every day, pump up the floats,
Right.
and you have to make traffic slow down. You can't have two tanks, 40 tons each, close up because your bridge sags. So the MPs will control the traffic on the beach. A couple of times we got fired on by snipers, but not really. I was trying to cross a small stream, and a German civilian, an old man, he told us to go ahead. And we went down the tracks into the river, and then somebody had built a floating footbridge across the river.
Okay.
So we were going alongside, just downstream of this floating bridge. And the Jeep went down deep and it came back up, and it was water. The water shorted out the engine and it quit. So I told the driver, I said, I should stay right here, and I was able to reach the bridge and climb out. I wanted to go ahead to see if there was more holes. And about that far in front of my front wheels were a whole string of German tank mines. If we had gone another 6 inches, we'd have been blown sky high. So I got my carbine and I went back on shore. Started looking for that old man, but I couldn't find him. That's the closest I came to getting killed in the war. That and then Vietnam.
As you had a chance to look at it, you served during 3 wars. How do you think your combat experience, your time in the military, during these 3 wars, how do you think that's affected your life?
I don't know. I was asked before by people about PSTD
Yeah.
and all of that, but I never had any problem. I never had any problem with leadership. I never had any problem with stress.
Right.
I don't know why, but I'm just one of the lucky people. And I have an exceptionally good memory for names and for places and events. Oh, by the way, the man in the rotunda that I was talking with was Billy Graham, the Reverend Billy Graham.
For Kennedy's?
Yeah, Kennedy's
Wow.
funeral.
Interesting.
So, it's been an interesting experience.
I'm sure.
I have, one other thing. After the funeral was over in the church, all these 100 limousines were coming down to follow in the parade to the cemetery. And I was outside the church there at the time. So I have a photograph of myself standing with Jacqueline Kennedy and the casket coming down, all of that.
Right.
After that, she, of course, and the kids went down and got into a car. And I was standing there, and alongside me was Emperor Haile Selassie of Ethiopia. Next to him was President de Gaulle of France. De Gaulle was 6'4", and Selassie was 5'4". They left and got in the car, and then this other man came up to me and he says, "Do you know where our car is?" And I looked at him, and it was Prince Philip of England.
Wow.
So he was there with the Prime Minister. So, and I got to see, as I say, they had about 80 countries at that funeral. And I saw all of those people come through the church within a few feet of me. Eisenhower, Nixon, Hoover's son, you name them.
Yeah.
All the big people from Europe, King of Norway, the President of Italy, and all that. So that's been an interesting experience.
What was your role during the funeral?
I was an escort officer.
Okay. Who did you escort?
I escorted Adlai Stevenson
Oh, Stevenson. Okay.
and the House of Representatives.
Gotcha.
So,
Somebody watches this video, your interview, in a few years or 100 years down the road. What message would you like to send them about your service?
message? I've never thought about it. I never had any problem, as I say, with leading men in combat or leading men in support of combat. I enjoyed it. I was well educated, experienced, and I never had a problem in the Army.
Would you recommend the military to someone, a young person?
Yeah, people have asked me, my son's going into service, what do you recommend? Where should he go? And I said, well, I don't really know. I know the Army,
Yeah.
Navy, Air Force and Marines, Coast Guard. They said, if you weren't going back into service, where would you go if you started out again? I said, well, let's start out in the Air Force. I think that, and not the Air Force, maybe Coast Guard.
Yeah.
And actually, I didn't have any problem with Marines, although they were a little bit difficult in the Pentagon. When you work in JCS, you don't wear a uniform most of the time. You wear civilian clothes.
Right.
So it makes it easier. But some of them are so damn stubborn about things, you know. You can't convince them any other way.
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, sir, I want to thank you for sitting down and talking to us. It's a
You're
pleasure to
welcome.
meet you. Pleasure to hear your story. And thank you very much for your service.
You're welcome, sir.
Through three wars. Very impressive.
I never thought of it until after I got out of it all.
Well, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.